Hi everyone, it's Desiree, and I am here with the Simon Says November 2018 card kit. So, while this one, it's absolutely beautiful, I will admit that this kit was just a little bit challenging. I know a lot of people had many comments on this kit, but it's just different. So that's how we just need to look at it. It doesn't have images that we can color. They're solid images. And sometimes that's all we have. So let's jump in. Let's get started. This one is very simple. So just using the sentiment family is everything. I put that in my stamp positioner and I'm going to use my VersaFine black ink. But first I'm going to treat my paper with my anti-static tool. And then once I have that stamped, and I believe I stamp it a couple times just to make sure that I have a good solid impression, I am going to use my clear embossing powder to heat set that, just to give it, just to give the sentiment a little bit of shine. I'm going to put this now back into my stamp positioner because there's just one stamp that I'm going to use, and it's one of the branches. So I'm going to place that down. Now, I always have scrap pieces of acetate or packaging sitting on my table because I don't clean. And I use that, especially if I've used the stamp before. I forget where I saw that. I think I either saw that with either Kelly or Jennifer. One of them had shown that. So you can see once I put it on the acetate, I can just sit here and move it, put it into the place, and then just close the lid to my stamp positioner and it'll pick it up right where I want it to stamp. So it is kind of easier to use that. It's actually the first time I did that. So with the two branches, I did use my Gina K charcoal brown, and I just stamped two of those branches going in each direction. I'm going to cover up the gap with a button from my stash. I have thousands of buttons, and I just grabbed some from each of the bags that I have and just put them in a mason jar, and I have them sitting on my table so I can dump it out at any time and start digging for that right color. Used a piece of hemp cord, and I'm just stringing it through the button, and I'm going to trim those edges off down close to the button, and that's pretty much where that is going to sit. I'm going to use a glue dot to eventually adhere that in that section. Before I take the panel and put it on my standard A2 size card base, I am going to go around the edges with my vintage photo just to give it some shading, some dimension. I'm going to use my Altenew tape runner, and I'm going to adhere that onto, I first pulled out the Desert Storm, but I went with a maroon 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 top folding card base. And of course this panel will cover the entire front of the card base. I did use my Lawn Fawn stitch rectangle, the largest size, to cut out my panel. I'm going to adhere a glue dot in the back of the button, and I'm going to set that in place. Glue dots are awesome. They're extremely strong. Very much so. I'm then using this piece of acetate because I didn't know if I wanted to use my red berry Nuvo drop or if I wanted to use the ruby slippers. And of course I always go with the ruby slippers. It's always the winner because it's just a deep red. And I like that shade of a red. So I'm just putting some berries throughout the branches. Nothing specific. Some are small, some are large. It doesn't have to be exact. You could put it directly onto the leaves if you wanted to. I just kind of placed it all around. And that is our first card. That was very simple. So for our next card, I pulled out a piece of vellum. I first wanted to work on my sentiment. And the sentiment I chose here is "So happy you are family." And I'm just going to stamp that down. Now first, I really treated the vellum with my anti-static powder tool. And when you do that, remember, when you do use your Versafine or your Versamark or the Simon Says Stamp Clear like I'm using, again, it's a clear sticky ink, but it doesn't mean it's going to stick when you stamp, so you will slide. So just make sure you don't shift your acrylic block when you do stamp. I pulled out my 9-inch Fisker tool to cut this to make sure that, one, I have a straight line, and two, it's even on the top and the bottom. So once I have that done, I did use my gold embossing powder. I'm going to set that aside. So I'm grabbing my panel here. I did use my Lawn Fawn Stitch Rectangle to cut this, and this is the second one down. And I grabbed a piece of Post-it tape strip, and I'm just deciding where I want to put this. So I'm going to go straight across. I'm using my grid mat to make sure that it's straight, and then just setting the sentiment over that to make sure that that was big enough, because we do have some loops that are coming down and coming up. So I grabbed Fired Brick, Wild Honey, Gathered Twigs, and Bundled Sage, and I am just going to stamp above and below the Post-it strip. Some I'm going to do first generation, I'm going to do second generation stamping, but I'm just going to fill in this whole section above and below this line. Now, the colors I chose are a little bit darker than, let's say, an orange or a red or a green. I'm never one that goes with traditional colors. I mean, these are traditional fall colors, but they're just different. They've got a different texture, if you want to say, or hue to them. It's just something that I do. So you don't have to go exactly with the same colors. Go with what you enjoy and what's pleasing to your eye. I'm going to pull back the Post-it tape. I do that slowly. It is Post-it tape, but it can tear the paper, so I just move very slowly, pull it back on itself, and now we have the strip that goes across. I'm just going to pull in my heat tool just to dry them just a little bit so I don't smudge them. I smudged a lot through these cards. Yeah. You can even see with some of the with the leaves that I added some colors. So if I used the Fired Brick, I took the edges of that stamp and went into the Gathered Twigs just to add some shading. It's just another reason why I am a huge fan of the Distress Oxides. They are very versatile. Just know, though, that their colors, if you're used to Distress inks, their colors are different. They're not the same. Your Distress inks are going to be transparent, clear, almost, but a dye ink. Where your oxides are solid, they're pigmented. So they can do both. So just a little tidbit there. I wrapped the vellum around this panel, making sure that the sentiment is centered in between the line that we created. I just grabbed a piece of brown cardstock from my stash. I cut it down just to be a little bit bigger than what my panel was, which I believe it's cut to 4 inches by 5 1/4. I'm going to set that and prop that up using some foam tape onto my standard A2 size card base. I'm just grabbing a small dot and I'm just putting that down underneath the vellum. Now that's going to be hidden, but I have to admit you couldn't really see the dot. I don't know. So I pulled out my dark walnut Nouveau drops and I'm just going to set some drops all around the card on the top and the bottom. And then I'm going to grab my Nouveau Deluxe adhesive and I'm just going to put some dots around because I'm going to set in place some of the large sequins that came in this kit as well. I didn't think I was going to like them because they're pretty big. I mean, they're a nice hefty size of a sequin. But I have to say, once they're on the cards, they do look great. Now the great thing, since they are that big, once you have them set, and you'll see me do this in another card, you can use your Nouveau drops, you can use your glossy accents, and give it a center of the sequence, so they can be, you know, like flowers if you wanted to. So that is card number 2. So for card number 3, yeah, this is that card where you're like, oh my, where was I going? So I'm going to show you the whole process. So I pulled out a piece of Canson XL watercolor paper. You could tell I took my inks and put them down onto my mat, because even though I taped it down, I was in the theory of I'm going to do ink smushing or I was going to watercolor it on. Wasn't quite sure. So I put the yellow down using a finger dauber, then picking it up from my mat. I'm now coming in with aged mahogany. I'm sorry, I can't keep a straight face on this one. I added dusty Concord. I still have moss green down there. Once I was there, I added water. Now, look, I think this is absolutely awesome when it dries. I think it's a panel that I'm definitely going to keep. It's not one for this card, but I just wanted to show you that. It's just, yeah, it was bad. So we are going to do ink smushing now. So I pulled out my inks. This is fossilized amber. I put it down on my craft mat, and I have added water to it, and I've dipped down into it. Now, the key when you're layering and ink smushing is dry in between, because you can see after I had that dry, I am using the Ranger heat tool. I go back down into it, and now I've got the dots of the fossilized amber. So I can get different values of these colors, even though it's the same. So I'm going to clean that off. I'm going to put now the aged mahogany, and I'm going to pick this up. Very lightly, going up and down, doing the ink smushing, because I really wanted dots. I didn't want it to mix too much. So the more you move it around and pick up that color, it will react with the color underneath it. So you can see that's why I have some corals. And almost pink shades going on there. The next color I'm going to come in is with Dusty Concord. And yes, now you've really got to be careful putting this one, because you will get mud. When it comes to these colors mixing together, they will create a mud or a brown, because they don't mix well. I mean, they mix. If you want brown, they've got it, but not looking for that. I do want to see the purple. So real quick, once and done. You can't force that. But again, make sure each layer is dry in between, and you've got that moment to be able to pick up that color. Now, you could have also just splashed, used a brush and flicked the purple on. I didn't want to do that. I am, however, going to flick on ground espresso and the forest moss. So again, got a lot of flecks going on here. In my mind, everything does dry back. When it comes to these colors, because you're using them as a watercolor technically, they will dry back. So theory in my head was these are going to get lighter, and they're going to go back. So I grabbed the sentiment, so grateful for everything you do and your support, but most of all, I'm thankful for the amazing person you are. And I grabbed 3 of the small solid leaves, and I have them coming off the corner, almost looking like feathers. I'm really going to treat this with my anti-static tool. I made sure that it was dry using the heat tool. And I'm going to come in, I'm going to use my clear ink again by Simon Says, and I'm going to stamp this down on my panel, and I'm going to use my gold. Now, I stamped this a couple times just to make sure. Again, my watercolor paper is the Canson XL. It is my paper of choice, but it is textured, so I will stamp a couple times to make sure that my image is going to be solid. I'm keeping my stamps on my positioner. I don't want to move them yet, because if something should go wrong, they're still there. So always think about that. I'm just going to pour the gold embossing powder on, and I'm going to heat set that. This is pretty, but you can see I'm looking at it, and I really can't see the sentiment. It actually shows up better on video than it does when I was looking at it. So I took a chance with the stamps still being in place, using my VersaFine ink, thinking, okay, maybe I can go over with the VersaFine ink and see what this will do. Now, of course, when you put the VersaFine ink on top of something that's already embossed, it will pull up. It's not a solid image. But I really like the look. It actually made the gold embossing powder look aged. So it's still tough to see because of all of the work that I did in the panel. It's still never a card to throw away. You just keep going. But the black did pull out the sentiment. Now what's funny is the camera doesn't show it too much, but when you actually look at it, you can read the sentiment very clearly. So very interesting. I kind of like the look. So yeah, just taking VersaFine on top of something already embossed. Very different. I pulled a piece of gold cardstock from my stash. I cut it to 4 inches by 5 1/4 so that I can set all of these panels down onto my standard A2 size card base. And that is our card. We are not going to add anything else to that. I think it's very different, but each card's unique. So, for card number 4, again, when it came to this kit, I was looking at very monotone colors, but different when it comes to those shades. So I pulled out the sentiment, "Thank you for your thoughtfulness," and I'm going to stamp that towards the top of my panel. I'm not worried about centering or anything like that, only because I'm going to come in with a stitched rectangle die by Lawn Fawn and cut my panel down. I used my excuse me, I used my gold embossing powder and heat set that, and now we're going to go to town stamping. So I'm using the Gina K charcoal brown, and I'm using the Stampin' Up! Elegant Eggplant. So I pulled one of the solid leaves, and I'm doing a second generation stamp from that image. And I'm going all across the bottom, not caring if I'm overlapping. I want to come up along the side. I then grab another leaf trail, and I'm using the first generation stamp from the Elegant Eggplant. And of course you saw there I went into the charcoal brown, so we needed to put that away and get that out away from front of me. Yes, it was good. Then I'm going to come in with Tranquil Tide by Stampin' Up, and I'm using the very small skinny leaf. And again, that's just adding the pop of color, but it's still muted. It's still a dark color. So once I have that done, I grabbed some twine and I doubled it up and tied a bow. And then I'm going to dig into my button stash again and pull a button out. And I'm going to actually set that bow. That's my container. And that's only, I would say, 1/100th of the buttons I have. Got lots of buttons. So I used a small glue dot to set the bow on top of the button. I cut a piece of the Tranquil Tide from Stampin' Up to 4 inches by 5 1/4, set my panel up that, grabbed some foam square scraps. I'm going to set them on the back. I'll trim that one down so that I can set that onto my standard A2 size card base, which is now side folding. I'm going to grab a larger glue dot, put that behind the button, and then set that in place onto my card panel. And that card is pretty much completed. So very simple, very basic. For the last card, I pulled out fired brick, fossilized amber, bundled sage, and wild honey. So we are just going to go to town and stamp with the maple leaf. So started with the fossilized amber, then coming in with the wild honey, turning it, making sure it's going different ways. So what I'm trying to create here is like a leaf pile that you would jump in, but then make it look like it's coming up the side of the card, making it look like the wind is catching the leaves, so to speak, I guess. And the only stamp, the focal stamp that I wanted to use is just the maple leaf. I really like that stamp. I think it's really pretty. I did choose one of the larger leaves, and I'm using the bundled sage for that. And then to fill in those smaller open areas, I'm going to use one of the very small leaves, and I'm going to use forest moss just to fill that in, and which will counterbalance, at least for me, the fired brick, because that's so dark and rich. This is just that balance for it, because everything else is kind of soft when it comes to the shades that I used. So we're just going to fill in those areas. Now, what was perfect, I'm taking the thank you stamp, and what's great is the U on thank you fits actually perfect in this little nook that I had in the stamps. You know, some things just work out. Yeah. So we're going to set that. And yes, the wonky stitch die rectangle finally makes an appearance again. Yes, I missed my wonky stitch rectangles. I'm going to come in with my vintage photo around the edge, and I'm going to set that up on my Desert Storm panel. I cut that to be 4 by 5 1/4, and I'm just going to set this panel right on top of that, and then both of these panels will be adhered onto my standard A2 size card base. I'm just going to trim off that edge. I'm not sure what I was cutting, but obviously not what I thought. So I just used my long shears. They're always close by to do that. I can get a straight cut by using those. To adhere that panel, added some more vintage photo, but to adhere that panel, I am going to use my Nuvo Deluxe liquid adhesive, and then I'm going to use it to set some dots all over the place because we had to add a lot of sequins. And then once the sequins are in place, and what I'm using to apply the sequins is a wax pencil. Now, since these are so large, the opening on the sequin is really large. So I'm getting glue on the tip of the wax pencil, so that's why I'm taking it to my left hand. I'm just cleaning it off, just in case there's any glue there. Once they are in place, I pulled in my Gold Coast Nuvo drops, and I filled in the centers and added a few going around the side. So these are the close-ups of the cards, regular speed. We don't have to watch them kind of wing by there. But once I got started, you can create some beautiful cards with this kit. Yes, they are solid images. They are tough to color in, but that doesn't mean you can't get creative with your inks that you have. Whether they're dye inks, whether they're oxides. You can still do the same techniques. You can still roll them into colors and so forth. So I hope you did enjoy the video. If you did, make sure you hit the thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe. You don't want to miss all the wonderful videos that are coming up. And there's going to be a huge series coming out soon. So stay tuned for that. If you have any questions or comments, leave those down below. I will make sure I get back to you as soon as I can. And of course, as always, all of the products that I used outside of the kit, along with the stamp set for the kit, will be linked down below as well if you wanted to check them out further. I hope everyone's having a great day. At least in our area, we are starting to get ready for winter, which sucks, but that's okay. But always remember what's most important. Always be creative.